Jeremiah 38. Shephatiah the son of Matan, and Gedaliah the son of Pashur, and Jucal the son of Shelemiah, and Pashur the son of Malchijah, heard the words that Jeremiah spoke to all the people, saying, Yahweh says, He who remains in the city will die by the sword, by the famine, and by the pestilence, but he who goes out to the Chaldeans will live, and he will escape with his life, and he will live. Yahweh says, This city will surely be given into the hand of the army of the king of Babylon, and he will take it. Then the princes said to the king, Please let this man be put to death, because he weakens the hands of the men of war who remain in this city, and the hands of all the people, in speaking such words to them, for this man doesn't seek the welfare of his people, but harm. Zedekiah the king said, Behold, he is in your hand, for the king can't do anything to oppose you. Then they took Jeremiah and threw him into the dungeon of Malchijah the king's son, that was in the court of the guard. They let down Jeremiah with cords. In the dungeon there was no water but mire, and Jeremiah sunk in the mire. Now, when Ebedmelech the Ethiopian, a eunuch who was in the king's house, heard that they had put Jeremiah in the dungeon, the king was then sitting in Benjamin's gate, Ebedmelech went out of the king's house and spoke to the king, saying, My lord the king, these men have done evil in all that they have done to Jeremiah the prophet, whom they have cast into the dungeon. He is likely to die in that place where he is, because of the famine, for there is no more bread in the city. Then the king commanded Ebedmelech the Ethiopian, saying, Take from here 30 men with you, and take up Jeremiah the prophet out of the dungeon before he dies. So Ebedmelech took the men with him, and went into the house of the king under the treasury, and took from there rags and worn-out garments, and let them down by cords into the dungeon to Jeremiah. Ebedmelech the Ethiopian said to Jeremiah, Now put these rags and worn-out garments under your armpits, under the cords. Jeremiah did so. So they drew up Jeremiah with the cords, and took him up out of the dungeon, and Jeremiah remained in the court of the guard. Then Zedekiah the king sent and took Jeremiah the prophet to himself into the third entry that is in Yahweh's house. Then the king said to Jeremiah, I will ask you something, hide nothing from me. Then Jeremiah said to Zedekiah, If I declare it to you, will you not surely put me to death? If I give you counsel, you will not listen to me. So Zedekiah the king swore secretly to Jeremiah, saying, As Yahweh lives, who made us this soul, I will not put you to death, neither will I give you into the hand of these men who seek your life. Then Jeremiah said to Zedekiah, Yahweh, the God of armies, the God of Israel, says, If you will go out to the king of Babylon's princes, then your soul will live, and this city will not be burned with fire. You will live along with your house. But if you will not go out to the king of Babylon's princes, then this city will be given into the hand of the Chaldeans, and they will burn it with fire, and you won't escape out of their hand. Zedekiah the king said to Jeremiah, I am afraid of the Jews, who have defected to the Chaldeans, lest they deliver me into their hand, and they mock me. But Jeremiah said, They won't deliver you. Obey, I beg you, Yahweh's voice. In that which I speak to you, so it will be well with you, and your soul will live. But if you refuse to go out, this is the word that Yahweh has shown me. Behold, all the women who are left in the house of Judah's, who are left in the king of Judah's house, will be brought out to the king of Babylon's princes, and those women will say, Your familiar friends have turned on you, you have prevailed over you. Your feet are sunk in the mire, and have turned away from you. They will bring out all your wives and your children to the Chaldeans. You won't escape out of their hands, but will be taken by the hand of the king of Babylon. You will cause this city to be burned with fire. Then Zedekiah said to Jeremiah, Let no man know of these words, and you won't die. But if the princes hear that I have talked with you, and they come to you and tell you, Declare to us now what you have said to the king, don't hide it from us, and we will not put you to death. Also tell us what the king has said to you, then you shall tell them, I presented my supplication before the king, that he would not cause me to return to Jonathan's house and die there. Then all the princes came to Jeremiah and asked him, and he told them according to all these words that the king had commanded. So they stopped speaking with him, for the matter was not perceived. So Jeremiah stayed in the court of the guard until the day that Jerusalem was taken. Okay. So Jeremiah is, he's perceived as being, he's perceived as having a, what do you call it? As undermining the morale of the troops. Because he's saying things like, you know, if you go out to the Babylonians, you will save your life. But if you stay here in the city, you will die. It's kind of like you've got to do the opposite thing to what you think. You know, in other words, don't try to fight and save your life. Give it up, and if you do, you'll live. But if you it's a bit like in the New Testament where Jesus says, "He who tries to save his life will lose it, but he who loses his life for my sake in the gospel will find it." You might remember Jesus said that in the Gospels. Well, there's a message kind of like that right here. It's the opposite of what you would naturally think. You'd naturally think, oh, we're doomed. The Babylonians are going to kill us. Stay and fight. But Jeremiah's saying, stop fighting. And so because of this message, it's like perceived as undermining the morale of the Jewish army and the Jewish troops. And of course, it is undermining the morale because it's the opposite of what the king wants. You know, the king wants them to fight, but Jeremiah is saying, don't fight, give up. So yeah, it is undermining their morale. And so they don't like it. And they say, this guy should be killed. And so they say to the king, let's kill him. And he says, you can do with him whatever you want. So they throw him into this translation calls it a dungeon. Other translations call it a cistern. And it actually is a cistern. It's apparently you can go and see this cistern in Jeremiah. You can go see this cistern in Jerusalem today, although it has a big grate and a padlock across the top so you can't get in. But I was listening to a Bible commentator who was talking about how he was on tour in Israel and they actually let the tour go down into Jeremiah's cistern. And he was explaining how there was this, it's basically kind of like a well that goes into the ground, but then underneath the ground it opens up into this big area. Basically it's like a rainwater tank, but under the ground. It's a place where they would store water, so they had a water supply. And, when the water supply is full, that's what a cistern is, it's a water supply. Well, obviously the water is really high, but when the water supply is empty, it's just, like mud on the bottom. So obviously at the time of this story, it was just mud. And at the time of the Bible commentator that I was listening to, this is Dr. Bill Creasy, he was telling the story of how he went into Jeremiah's cistern. He said they climbed down the ladder and then they dropped into the mud, and he said it sunk up to around about their ankles. So it was just a few inches of mud. But he said the whole floor was just mud everywhere, and he said he didn't think it would have been a lot of fun to be there. I believe him, and it would have been probably similar for Jeremiah. And of course, you're not getting any food down there, and it's just dark. And so I guess you can go and see it in Jerusalem today. In Josephus, he says that Jeremiah sunk up to his neck. It doesn't sound like it's that deep when we just read this chapter. It sounds like there was mud, but it wasn't that bad. In any case, it's not a fun place to be. So these people that want to kill Jeremiah, they basically want him to die, but they don't want to do the killing. So they basically throw him into the cistern, and he's just going to die there, basically be abandoned to die. But Ebedmelech, the Ethiopian, this guy thinks this is wrong. He goes to the king and says, we can't do this. So the king says to, rescue him. So it seems like the king just does whatever anyone tells him to do, except for Jeremiah. So if someone says, let's kill Jeremiah, the king's like, sure, go for it. If someone says, let's rescue Jeremiah, sure, go rescue him. But if Jeremiah says to the king, go out to the Chaldeans, no. So it seems like the king is just like a bit wishy-washy, and he gives in to everyone, but he doesn't seem to be able to do what the Lord wants. And he was just a weak king. And so eventually they pull up Jeremiah, he's out of the pit, and then the king comes to Jeremiah privately on his own. Just making sure I got my notes here in the right place. Yeah. And so the king says to Jeremiah, what is the word of the Lord? And Jeremiah says, if I tell you, you're going to kill me and you won't believe me anyway. So the king makes a promise, I will not kill you and I will not hand you over to those who would kill you. In other words, Jeremiah now knows he can speak the truth, and the king, of course, doesn't have to listen, but he knows he can speak the truth, and he does. And the truth is, of course, if you go out to Nebuchadnezzar, the city will be saved and you will be saved. But if you don't go out, the city will be destroyed and you will be handed over. So it's the opposite of what he feels he should do. Now, and the gospel is a bit like this. The feeling we have as people is that we want to live our own life. We want to do what we want. We want to please ourselves. We want to make ourselves happy. We want to do what feels good. The whole world, it's so natural to us to follow our own instincts and desires, but you have to do the opposite of them. You have to give up your desires, give up your instincts to God, and in doing so, your life will be saved. Zedekiah hears the word, but he ignores it. He does not do it. In fact, he says to Jeremiah, he says, I'm scared of, let's find the exact part. Zedekiah, where is this? He says, I am afraid of the Jews who have defected to the Chaldeans. So there are actually Jews who were in the city, who'd fled the city. I'm guessing, maybe they did listen to Jeremiah, and they've gone to the Babylonians, and they are alive. So you'd think there's a living example right there that if you go to the Babylonians, they will not kill you. He's afraid of what they are going to say. Now, I want to just pause here for a moment and point out something which should be obvious, but for some reason, no one seems to have realized it. It's not like in any of the commentaries I read. I'm sure it's in some of the commentaries, and it seems like no one I've ever heard preach has observed this point, but it should be clear that Nebuchadnezzar, he attacked Jerusalem 3 times. There were 3 exiles. In other words, there were 3 times he came. The first 2 times he defeated Jerusalem but didn't destroy the city, but each time he would take away these exiles back to Babylon. The 3rd time is the one we're talking about right now, where he defeats Jerusalem and he does destroy the city and takes people back to exile. So the first time he comes, when he defeats Jerusalem, the king is, what was the name of the king? It escapes me, but he takes into exile Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and he takes these people. So if we go over to the book of Daniel and we start reading the early stories of Daniel, we read, like Daniel becomes a ruler in Babylon. So what we've got here is a situation where Nebuchadnezzar has actually left Babylon. Guess who's in charge? Daniel. In other words, the point is that some of the best and most trusted people in the Babylonian Empire were Jews. You've got a Jew here, Jeremiah, who's a prophet, who's saying to King Zedekiah, you're not going to be destroyed. You're going to be okay. Zedekiah is saying, I'm worried about the Jews that have already gone over to the king. Jeremiah is saying, don't worry about them. You're going to be fine. On the other side, there are Jews already there like Daniel and Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego. They've demonstrated to King Nebuchadnezzar that he can trust Jews. They're good people, that they are faithful to their God. Like there's this, it's kind of like from both angles, it could not have gotten better than that. And but Zedekiah could not trust the Lord. He could not believe the word of the Lord. And therefore, everything ended up. In fact, the fact that Jerusalem was destroyed was because of the hardness of heart of this man. And I guess there are people like this. They destroy their lives and they destroy their families because they cannot listen to the word of God. And so I'd encourage you not to be someone like that. The chapter finishes with Zedekiah saying to Jeremiah, don't tell anyone about our conversation. This is a secret. If someone comes to you and says, what were you talking about? What did the king say? Just tell them that you were pleading for your life. And so the fact is, we do know what this conversation was about. Clearly, Jeremiah did tell people. He wrote it down. So did Jeremiah betray the trust? Well, he did keep it a secret until after the whole matter was resolved, after Babylonians came, after Jerusalem was destroyed, after King Zedekiah was taken away. Then Jeremiah has written it down, and that's why we know about it to this day. And then Jeremiah was in prison, of course, from that point until Jerusalem was destroyed. I think the obvious takeaway from this chapter is that the Lord can be trusted. It's really obvious in hindsight looking at, this. Oh, Zedekiah should have trusted the Lord. Jeremiah was on one side, Daniel was on the other side. They were both speaking truth. It was all covered. It would have been fine. It would have been fine, but he didn't trust the Lord. And the real takeaway is we can trust the Lord, and we should. Lord, I thank you for this chapter. I ask for it to speak to us. I pray that we would not have the hard and stubborn hearts that, like what Zedekiah had. I pray for grace to be given to us. Help us, Lord, to believe your word and to base our lives upon it and thereby find life and salvation. Lord, help us. In Jesus' name, amen.